Today we are going to be talking about subtracting fractions. Subtracting fractions are really a lot like adding fractions. So first we're going to talk about when we are given fractions with a common denominator. When you are given problems with a common denominator, it's really only two steps. You look at your numerators and subtract them, and then simplify if you can. So there are two examples directly below. There is 3/7 minus 2/7. Our denominators, remember those numbers on the bottom, are the same. They are both a 7. So what we can do is just subtract our numerators. 3 minus 2 is 1, and that means our answer is 1/7. The other example there, 5/6 minus 3/6. Our denominators are the same. They're both a 6, so we can move on to subtracting the numerators. 5 minus 3 is 2. They have 2/6 as their final answer. I'm going to go ahead and talk about how we can simplify it. 2 and 6 are both even numbers, and all even numbers are divisible by 2. So when we go ahead and divide the top by 2, 2 divided by 2 is 1, and 6 divided by 2 is 3. That is actually what your answer would be in simplest form. But again, the steps there when you are given a common denominator is just subtract the numerators and simplify. There will be several times where you are not given a common denominator. You have different numbers on the bottom. In this scenario, the first thing you're going to do is find a least common denominator. Once you find a least common denominator, the rest of the steps are the same. You subtract your numerators and simplify. In this example, we have 11/15 minus 3/5. As you can see, 15 and 5 are not the same. So we're going to have to first find a least common multiple or a least common denominator. There's kind of obviously hints in this example, but what you should be able to find is that 15 and 5, the smallest number they can both multiply to make is 15, which is the common denominator we're going to use. That means 11/15 can stay exactly how it is, but 3/5 has to change, which is what they're showing right here. To turn a 5 into a 3, you have to to turn a 5 into a 15, you have to multiply by 3. Whatever you do to one side, you do to the other. So you're multiplying by 3 on the top and the bottom, which is how they are getting that 9/15. 3 times 3 is 9, and 5 times 3 is 15. Our new problem is now 11/15 minus 9/15. Since our denominators are the same, we can go ahead and subtract our numerators. 11 minus 9 is 2, and that's how we get our answer of 2/15. Before we get to the practicing, I want to mention that it can be helpful, just like with whole numbers, to write your subtraction problems vertically. Writing them vertically can be helpful for situations in which we need to borrow. We're not going to be doing that quite yet, but we want to prepare for that. So the first thing I'm going to do in these examples below is to write it vertically. My first number always goes on the top, 2 and 5, 6 on top. And my second number goes on the bottom, and I need to line up my fractions. If you look at your denominator, 6 and 4, they are obviously not the same, so we are going to have to find a least common multiple. The smallest number these can both multiply to make is 12, which is why I'm going to use that for my common denominator. There are other common denominators you can use. 12 is just the smallest. I'm going to go ahead and adjust my fractions with my new common denominator. So 2 and 5, 6. My whole number stays the same, but a 6 is going to become a 12. To turn a 6 into a 12, I have to multiply by 2. And whatever I do to one side, I do to the other. So I'm going to do 5 times 2 on the top and get 10 for my numerator. 3/4 also has to change to a denominator of 12. To turn a 4 into a 12, I have to multiply by 3. Do the same thing to the top. 3 times 3 is 9 for my numerator. Now that I've adjusted my fractions with a common denominator, I can go ahead and finish subtracting. To subtract my numerators, I'm going to do 10 minus 9, which is 1. My denominator stays the same. And for my whole numbers, I have 2 minus nothing, so I'm going to be left with 2 and 1/12 for my final answer. It cannot be simplified or reduced more than that. For my second problem, I'm going to start off the same way. I'm going to write it vertically, so I'm going to write 4 and 3/8 on the top, minus 1 and 1/5 on the bottom. 8 and 5 are not common denominators, so I need to find one. The least common multiple or least common denominator is going to be 40. That's the one I'm going to be using. So next I'm going to adjust my fractions. My whole number stays the same, but my 8 is becoming a 40. To turn an 8 into a 40, I need to multiply by 5. Whatever I do to the bottom, I do to the top. 3 times 5 is 15. That is my new numerator. Now I need to adjust my second fraction. My whole number stays the same. The denominator is becoming a 40. To turn a 5 into a 40, I need to multiply by 8. Do the same thing to the top. 1 times 8 is 8. Now I can continue subtracting now that I have a common denominator. For my numerators, I'm going to do 15 minus 8, which is 7. My denominator stays the same. And 4 minus 1 is 3. 7 over 40 cannot reduce any further because 7 is a prime number. So my final answer in simplest form is 3 7/40. Switching to the back, we are also going to talk about situations where you're going to have to borrow. Okay, we borrow with whole numbers, and sometimes we're going to have to do that with fractions as well. So when we borrow with fractions, the first thing we're going to do is the same as the front. We're going to have to find a common denominator, and I would recommend setting it up vertically. Then when you borrow, this is typically where people do it incorrectly or get confused. When you're borrowing, to figure out how much you're giving to the numerator, you're going to look at the denominator. You are always looking at the denominator. That is the biggest mistake people make. Okay, so you look at your denominator for how many to give, and once you're finished borrowing, you will continue to subtract your numerators and simplify your final answer. So, oops, what happened to my, there we are. My example here, we have, our original problem is 3 3/9 minus 1 5/9. If you look at your numerators, you cannot do 3 minus 5 in that order. So we're going to have to borrow. So we borrow from our whole number, which they show there. They turn that 3 into a 2. And you are always looking at your denominator. So right here it explains it. Since our denominator is in ninths and we are borrowing one whole, we are regrouping with that 9 over 9, or we're adding. So we are giving that 3/9 another whole, which is 9/9. When you're giving it, you're going to add, which is where we get the 12/9. 3 plus 9 on the top is 12. Our denominator stays the same. Now our new problem is 2 12/9 minus 1 5/9. We can continue subtracting. 12 minus 5 is 7. Our denominator stays the same, which is a 9. And 2 minus 1 is 1 for our whole number, making our final answer 1 7/9. We're going to practice borrowing a couple of times on the bottom. We're going to start with 3 1/2 minus 4/5. Just like on the other side, I'm going to write it vertically. So I'm going to write 3 1/2 on the top minus 4/5 on the bottom. Our denominators are not the same, so we do need to find a least common multiple or a least common denominator. Looking at our denominators, we have 2 and 5. The smallest number they can both multiply to make is 10, and that's what I'm going to adjust my denominators to. So my whole number stays the same. My denominator becomes a 10. In order to turn a 2 into a 10, we have to multiply by 5. Do the same thing on the top. 1 times 5 is 5 for that problem. For the second fraction, again, I'm changing it to a 10 on the denominator. To turn a 5 into a 10, I have to multiply by 2. Do the same thing to the top. 4 times 2 is 8. Now that we've adjusted our fractions, we can subtract. But when I look at my fractions, I have 5 minus 8, which I cannot do, so I'm going to have to borrow. I'm borrowing from that whole number. It becomes a 2. I am giving one whole number to my 5. But remember, I look at my denominator. Since I'm working with tenths here, I'm going to give 10 to my numerator. So that 5 is going to become a 15 because 5 plus 10 is 15. Now I can continue subtracting. 15 minus 8 is 7 for my numerator. My denominator stays the same. And 2 minus nothing is 2 for my whole number. Again, I cannot simplify that more because 7 is a prime number. So 2 7/10 is my final answer for the first example. For the second example, I'm going to start by writing it vertically. 10 on the top, 7 and 1/7 on the bottom. Make sure you line up your whole numbers and your fractions. And if you notice, 10 doesn't have a fraction. It's missing a fractional part there. So basically that's like having 0 for my numerator. And since I do need my denominators to be the same, I'm going to go ahead and write 7 on the bottom. I have 0. I have nothing for the fraction. I cannot do 0 minus 1, so I'm going to borrow from that 10, making it a 9. And I'm always looking at my numerator for how many to borrow here. So if I'm starting with 0 and I'm giving it 7 more, I'm going to end up with 7 on top. Now I can continue subtracting. 7 minus 1 is 6. My denominator stays the same. 9 minus 7 is 2. And 6 over 7 cannot be reduced, so 2 and 6/7 is my answer in simplest form. For the final example, I have 4 and 3/4 minus 1 and 9/10. I'm going to start by writing it vertically. First number on top. Second number on bottom. Line up your whole numbers and your fractions. My denominators are a 4 and a 10. Those are not the same, so I need to find a least common multiple or a least common denominator. The smallest one that you can use here is 20. I'm going to go ahead and adjust my fractions with that new common denominator. My 4, my whole number stays the same, but my 4 is, for my denominator, is changing to a 20. To turn a 4 into a 20, I have to multiply by 5, and I have to do the same thing to the top. 3 times 5 is 15. For my second fraction, my whole number stays the same, but I am changing the other parts. To turn a 10 into a 20, I have to multiply by 2. Do the same thing with the top. 9 times 2 is 18. Now that I've got a common denominator, I can continue subtracting. I cannot do 15 minus 18, so I am going to borrow from my whole number. That 4 becomes a 3. I always look at my denominator to see how many to give. I am starting with 15, but I am giving it 20 more. 15 plus 20 is 35. Now that I've borrowed correctly, I can continue subtracting. 35 minus 18 is 17. My denominator stays the same, 20. And 3 minus 1 is 2. My final answer in simplest form is 2 and 7/20 because 17 over 20 cannot be simplified. So again, my final answer is 2 and 17/20. A couple things that I want to recap for you guys. Remember, with subtracting fractions, just like with adding, you need a common denominator. So if you do not have one, that's the first thing you need to look for or find. The second thing is when you borrow, you are always looking at your denominator for how many to give. Okay, always look at your denominator for how many to give the numerator. Please make sure you check in with the teacher, make sure you finished it correctly, and please ask questions if you are confused at any point.